possibilities that Procreate brings to the table are amazing. So over in the App Store, we have right here, #1 most popular app, Procreate. So let's see if I can find where it's at in the store, because I think that other link will just open it up. So let's see what they say. So 39,000 4-star ratings or higher. It's not a very big program. The thing to understand about all these drawing programs, and this is not the only drawing program on here, there's a ton of drawing programs, but the thing to understand about all of these programs, even not necessarily even drawing programs, is that you're going to have a lane of programs that's very easy to use and a lane of programs that is insanely powerful, and they're not always the same thing. So when it comes to drawing, Procreate is definitely the easy to use one. There's other programs that have other tools that are more powerful, but as they all keep upgrading, I do have to say that the usability and ease of use offered by Procreate is top-notch. So let's open her up. When you open Procreate, you're going to come here to the gallery, and your gallery is where all the work that you are doing or have done is stored. You can also select multiple items, and it's called stack in here, but it's basically just making a folder. It's the same thing whether you call it stack or folder. So just remember that if you want to keep your artwork organized, maybe you have older stuff, maybe there's a certain group of stuff that you have that's all portfolio work. Let me actually, while we're doing this, I'm going to turn on my screen recorder. So yeah, so you can come through this whole gallery here and, you know, work on pieces at will. The reason that Procreate is so strong is, so obviously the iPad itself is very expensive, but Procreate is not very expensive. So there is an investment in getting an iPad if you're not into that sort of thing, but most of us already have it. And it's all the paper, all the canvas, all of the ink, all of the pencils, pens that you could ever need in your entire art setup, all in one thing that's not even the size of a notebook, or not even as thick as a notebook, or a sketchbook, and you can take it with you anywhere, wherever you go, as long as you have electricity, you know, to charge in between uses, then you're golden. So it's really, really hard to beat, and definitely something that, you know, I run into a lot of people who are kind of more scared of technology, which I don't think it's going back in the bag. So I want to help everybody to just understand the tools that they have so they can use them better and be more creative. So let's go ahead and so like I showed, we can select multiple items. We can import a drawing or an image. We can import a photo and work straight from that, or we can start a new canvas. I prefer to work at the exact same size. This is already probably going to print out, so 11 by 8.5 paper. And I also like to start with a mid-tone in the background. So first thing we're going to deal with is this section over here. And this section is going to be your brushes. When you open it up, you'll have your brush library. So these are my basics. This is what I use all the time. And then over here we have all the libraries of all the different types of brushes that I have or have purchased or anything over the years, right? So you can make your own brush sets, you can make your own brushes. We're going to get into that next time. So you can make your own brushes, you can have brush sets, you can edit those brushes, you can change how those brushes individually work. So for instance, if you have something such as, I think I used the hard airbrush and then took the opacity, it does the opacity based on the pressure of the pen, and I took that off. And then made it so that it will only get so big. So that way it's just a straight line. So if I'm lining something and I want there to be a fat line on the outside and a skinny line in the inside, I would use something like this because it's going to be very controlled all the way, as opposed to something that has a more painterly feel. You can also change the spacing of how that stroke is going to be made. So this line is just a dot that's repeated so much and so often that you can't tell that it just looks like a line. Here I've turned up the spacing so that it makes dots. I use this in my stenciling process to outline highlights. So if you ever see one of my stencils and there's a bunch of dotted lines there, it's probably transitions between colors and tones or highlights. You also have some pencil type brushes. You also have some pencil and texture type brushes. So that'll be like, give you this kind of stroke. The pencil, same thing. It's going to give you a stroke that has the texture to it. The cool thing about the pencil is you can lay it down sideways and get a totally different result from standing the pencil up than you do getting it on its side. So that can be very useful. It's very natural. It feels quite a bit like traditional media. This next one over is your smudge tool and then your eraser. Now these two tools are going to operate off the same brush library. They're just separated so that when you pick one and you go back to the tool, you go back to the same tool all the time. We're going to skip this for just a second and come over here to this blue dot. So this is your color picker, and you can pick any color you want. You can change the tones of this whole thing up and down. Mine might look a little bit different than yours is when you open it up. The difference is down here. So I think this is the natural one they use, or the primary one they use. This ring out here is going to select your color, and the top left is white. All the way at the bottom is black, and then your top right is your fully saturated color. In your classic color picker, you have white at the top and black on the bottom on the left side, and you have the same thing on the right side. It's just your saturation is all the way up over here. And you can use these bars to change which colors you want if you want to, depending on how you want to change that. And if you look on here, this is the hue. So this is going to change the actual color that's being picked, but this slider is just a saturation slider. It's going to leave the brightness of the color alone and just take you more or less saturated, right? Same with this one. It's just going to raise you up and down in your value scale and leave it exactly where it's at in saturation. I like this color picker because this is going to give you harmonies. So like most of the stuff we learn about the color wheel is all about color harmonies. And so what's most important about the color wheel is what colors are opposite of each other, right? So let's actually just change this for a minute to complementary. So what this is going to do is always pick you the color on the opposite side of the wheel so that you know your colors are always complementary. You can just switch back and forth between them, right? You can also do split complementary. You can also do analogous, which is going to keep all the colors on the same side of the color wheel. Triadic, which will have 3 colors equidistant around the color wheel. And tetradic is the same thing. It's got 4. I don't know why it's not called quadratic, but in any event, I like this split complementary that will have, you'll be able to pick a primary color, and then it will tell you which 2 colors to have on the other side of the color wheel. You can also change this slider so that if you're using a very dark primary color or a very dark color as your main selection, as your primary selection, you can choose lighter colors for the... There's also a slider down here, so if you were to pick your primary color to be a pretty dark color or mid-range and you wanted your other colors to be lighter in value, you can just slide that here, and these three selection areas will stay the same. We also just have a regular value scale, so like you can change all this by the sliders. I don't really like it because it doesn't really give you a good visualization during the process, but it's there. Over here in palettes, we have palettes of different colors that we like. So you can put in all the colors that you have. You can put in like a specific ink company. You could take a picture of your ink and then drop those colors in here. And what's really cool is that, let me actually, so if we were to take a photo of this ink and we take a screenshot of it and we crop it, we actually might not even need to do that. So what you can do here is add from photos, take this last photo, and here's this whole, all the colors that were in that photo, right? You can name it, and that way you know where the colors came from. You can also slide it in. If you have two windows open, you can slide the image into here, I think, without very much work. So let's get into the layer stack. Now, I got a little line on this layer. Let's get rid of it. Now, what do we do in layers? We paint in layers, right? So I think actually the easiest way to discuss layers and tackle brushes at the same time is we have these things called stamp brushes. It's the easiest way the brushes work. You just stamp it down and it leaves a stamp 100% perfect every time. So let's actually find, so let's talk about stamp brushes. I'm going to use this picture frame right here from the Go Baroque set of brushes from Tattoo Smart. I think it's one of Russ Abbott's own sets. And we're just going to put that here. Now, I do want to select black before I do this. And I want to get back over to my color harmonies. Why? So that's all it takes. You just stamp it down like anything else would stamp, right? And then now you have your lines separated from your background. So the way these layers work, you can think of them as panes of glass or sheets of tracing paper that are as clear as glass. So what you really always want to do is have a couple of layers in there and keep your lines on the top whenever possible. So I'm going to do a little demo to help kind of discuss some things in here that are pretty important. So if you click on your layer, you're going to get a bunch of options. So you can rename your layer. I recommend renaming your layers because it's going to, I recommend renaming your layers because it's going to help you keep it organized later. And then, let's see. Oh. You can select everything that's in that layer. Just select the paint that's in that layer. You can copy what's in the layer. You can fill the layer. You can clear the layer. Alpha lock. Now let's deselect this. Alpha lock's very important. And the reason that alpha lock is important is if you can see the little checkerboard pattern that happens here, what it's going to do is make sure that all of the other transparent pixels in that layer stay locked. So now I cannot, let me switch back to a normal brush. I cannot paint on this layer, right? But if I have a different color, I can paint on the layer in the pixels that are already done, right? They're the pixels that have already been painted. So right now I'm switching these lines from black to red, but a lot of times if I'm stenciling something, I'm going to stencil it with a red pencil or a red pen. And then I'm going to, once I have everything perfect and I can tell what's going on and I can tell it apart from the background, I move that layer to the top, turn on alpha lock, and then I change the color of whatever's in the of all the lines to black so I can get it through a stencil machine. So next up we have mask and clipping mask, and those kind of do similar things, so we're going to deal with that in a minute. You can invert everything in the layer as far as the color goes. You can use this as a reference layer, or you can merge it down and combine it down. Now, what a reference layer means is that it's just like a coloring book, right? So if you make this the reference layer, whatever you do in this layer, let's pick a color. Let's go with orange or red, okay? So now I can fill the open hole. Oh, if I didn't talk about that before, by selecting the color in the corner and just dragging that onto the canvas, it's going to fill the open space. Now what we've done here is, because we made this a reference layer, it's going to take into account the lines that are on that layer. So if what's on this layer is just purple and red. If you want to, let's clear the layer. So if you have a line drawing and you want to fill it in very fast by just using the paint bucket tool, which we are going to get to in a little bit, then using reference layers is really the way to go. So let's actually just do this real quick. So we're going to switch back to our reddish color. Maybe a little bit more vibrant. I'm going to drag this in here. So what's going on here is that, like I said, it's just respecting what's in those line layers. The thing about it is it's going to respect it so good that it will leave, you can see this here in a second, these little gaps anywhere that the line was. Sometimes that's not a pain, sometimes it is. You'll just have to play with it to see what works for you. So let's get rid of those last two. And now what I want to do is use another color. Let's actually get rid of this. We're going to do it again. We're going to do purple here, purple here, purple here. Okay. Purple here. All these little lines, all these areas where the little lines are, it just really splits it up. Now, for the frame itself, personally, I feel like that is a little bit harder to do the paint bucket for everything. So what I would do with that is select a color that is useful. Oops. Make a new layer, put that layer underneath the other layer, and what that does is that whatever's in the layer on top, it's going to be opaque to the layer on the bottom. So the reason that I'm doing it this way, let's clear this, is because in here I don't have to be careful with my paint at all. Right? Because it's all behind that purple stuff. Now on the outside it matters, but in here I have a lot of room to just like paint and fill in without really getting, without really needing to be too careful about it. So now that I have filled in most of the stuff, I can come back and clean it up with this tool, which will respect the lines and stay in there pretty easily. And then also bump off of the color that I just put in there. So it will, or bump up next to the color that I put in there. So it will all be seamless. Cool. So now we have a frame with a purple background. If we turn off that purple background, we'll notice that the frame's kind of gnarly, or the frame, the color for the frame if we turn the purple off, we'll notice that the color for the frame goes well outside the lines, and that's just because we don't need to respect all those lines on the inside, because this part is already gonna make those edges clean for us. So we're using the paint bucket tool for the easy stuff, the brush tool underneath the paint bucket tool for the majority of the next one, and then the paint bucket tool to get some of the little painful areas out. So that's how the stamp brush works. That's how the other brushes work, and in order to fill them in, and then that's the basics of the layers. So to go a little bit deeper with the layers, one thing that I like to do is if I add layers in between, then I can, let's say we're going to use, let's say black. Let's just say that we want to do shading, and we're going to do simple shading. So we're going to use a gray and a soft brush, because the soft brush is going to give us this gradient, right, where it goes from black to nothing, black to transparent, I would say. So one thing I like to do is use a soft brush to get my transitions, and a hard eraser to get my hard lines and hard edges, right? I guess hard edges it would be. So the reason that works so well is because you can come and, let's say I want to focus on this part here, right? So now that's just everywhere and messy, but I can take my eraser and erase the parts where I don't want it, right? So it's a little bit different probably than how you're used to working if you've only done analog your whole life, but it's a very useful way to get your transition very, very smooth by using a brush that does that for you, kind of like using an airbrush. And then instead of masking everything off, you're using your eraser to come in and get your hard lines, or get your, I guess, hard edges. I keep calling them lines. So now this shadow is in its own layer, and that means that I can do a lot of stuff to it, right? I can turn the transparency of it up and down. I can change the style of the layer. The styles of the layers dictate how that layer handles the math of adding the layers together. So some of these things will darken your layer, and some of these things will lighten your layer. And as you can see, if I put it in lighten, you can't even see it, because it only respects the stuff that's going to lighten what's in the layer underneath it. Let's do a couple more. So always think about the economy of your movements, right? A lot of times I'm the king of too much scrubbing, where I just scrub everything everywhere, and it's much easier to just train yourself to use the right brush for whatever you're doing in the right size. So like I was saying, now we have this all separated into its own layers, and we can turn it on and off as we want, or change the style of how it's going to do that. Now, since I'm using black, most of these layers aren't going to work. So we'll just leave it normal. But up here, let's look at masking. What does masking do? So what masking is going to do is hide what's in this layer. So if I put a mask on this, right, you can't see it because the mask is white. What a white mask means is that everything that you put in that layer is going to show. What a black mask means is that everything that you put in that layer is going to be hidden. The reason you would want to do this is because then you can paint on the layer in black or white only and change the opacity of what's in that layer. So it'll bring it so that you can see it, right? So if I were to use a textured brush and black paint in my white mask layer, what that's going to do is change what's in the layer so we can see what's behind it, right? The reason this is better than maybe like deleting something or erasing something is it's called non-destructive editing. And what that means is that if I were to switch back to white, because I can only paint in white and black on a mask and paint back over what I was painting on, let's use a different brush so we can tell. It will just bring that whatever was in that layer back. So this is going to allow us to show and hide certain things and certain effects without losing what we put in the layer, right? So it might seem like a little bit much at first, but in the long run, it's really going to help. Now, what a clipping mask will do, slightly different. You can also select the mask layer and just clear it and invert it if you need to put a black mask on there, and then you want to paint in whatever your effect is, right? Now we can just paint this thing in and it'll stay right in those, right where it always was. Now, what a clipping mask is going to do, let's turn this off, turn this off, and this off. Now, what a clipping mask is going to do, if we add a new layer above and we say we want a clipping mask, you're going to get this little arrow, and that just means that these two layers are joined together. So if I paint in this layer, I can't paint where the previous layer doesn't exist, but I can paint across that layer, and I can recolor the pixels that are already in that layer. So what we're going to do here is, because we're using a clipping mask, we don't need to worry about going outside the lines. Now, if we turn off the clipping mask, all of that paint that we use is going to be there. So we're going to add a layer. We're going to make it a clipping mask, and we're going to pick, we want black, we want to do a shadow, and we're going to use a soft brush. So I want this thing to look kind of rounded, right? Kind of like a pad. So by brushing around the outside softly, I'm just letting the very end of that transitional, that transition there, affect what's in that layer. So now, as you can see, we can just turn off that shadow, or we can lessen the effect of that shadow. And the same is true with highlights. Now, I would probably keep my highlight in a different layer just because it's mainly because when you choose these different layer styles, black paint is dark, stuff that's darker is going to affect the pixels underneath in a different way than stuff that's lighter. So when you're picking through these layer styles, some of these are only going to affect lighter pixels. Some of them are only going to affect darker pixels. So that's why I would want them in separate layers, because you can't that way you can adjust each one independently. Now you just put in a little highlight, maybe change the layer style of that one to something else. See, some of them will make it darker and some will make it brighter. This is normal. This is what I painted in there. But some of these are brighter, some are more saturated, some are less saturated. And so it's a real easy way to check out a bunch of different effects to slide through this on different layers and find some, happy accidents. So now we've dealt with everything over on this side of the screen: the brushes, the smudge tool, the eraser, the layer stack, the color picker, the choices you have that you can make within the layer stack. So to recap, if we were to squash these layers together, because now we're not going to change them independently of one another anymore, we have the lines on top, the purple underneath that, the shadows on the brown. You can see how this shadow goes through the whole layer here, and the base color of the frame. And each of these layers, except for the lines, looks kind of messy if if you're really looking at it. But once you put it all together, you have a really nice, really easy to work with design and method of painting. One more thing to keep in mind is that if you have a regular brush, well, I guess any kind of brush, but not a stamp, you can, if you make a curve and hold it, it will keep that curve and you can move it to whatever size you want. If you make a straight line and hold it, it will straighten that line out and you can connect it where you want. Or if you tap the screen, it will click at certain angles. If you draw an ellipse, it will connect it for you and make a perfect ellipse. And if you use a tap with this, it'll give you a circle. You can also do squares. Sometimes the tapping works and sometimes it doesn't. So I did go through here and add some shadows and highlights, and just as a recap, you can go through these layer styles because I've used colors for both of them and not black, and you can scroll through and it will give you different results. So sometimes this is not very surprising. Sometimes you find stuff that's really cool. So this time I'm going to stick here with screen on my highlight layer and multiply on my shadow layer, but we can go through those too. I'm going to go ahead and save this, and for the rest of what we're working on, I think I'm going to start with something pretty simple. And so let's just grab this purple color that we got, because we got it, and we're going to open the layers. We're going to be in the right layer. We have a liner brush. We're going to make a circle. We're going to fill that circle with paint. We got to turn the reference layer off, or turn off the fact that it's a reference layer. So this arrow tool over here is going to allow you to select whatever's in that layer and move it around. If you select uniform, it will maintain the proportions at any scale. If you select freeform, it will allow you to change the proportions and the scale. If you select distort, that will allow you to change this and put it into perspective. You can do a lot of things with it. Putting things into perspective is what I do the most with it. And you can warp them. So the warp tool is very powerful for changing shapes and moving things where you want them, making them fill in the proper shape. You can turn it on and off snapping. You can flip it horizontal and vertical, which is very convenient and is going to be very convenient in later steps. You can rotate it 45 degrees at a time. You can fit it to the whole canvas, or you can change how the interpolation works. And this is going to be how the pixels are edited when you manipulate a layer in this way to affect the layers under it. So some of these options work faster, but don't give you as clean of a result. And that's kind of what's going on in here, but we'll get to that later probably. Now, this S is a selection tool. So generally I use freehand, and generally I will just circle what I need. Now you can select the move tool, uniform, and move whatever selection you use. It'll also give you a very hard edge. You can also automatically select what's in the layer, or use a rectangle or an ellipse to make your selection. All right. This will also allow you to invert your selection. Watch. Oh, this will also allow you to invert the selection so that you've got the background selection selected. Copy and paste your selection. Soften your selection so the edge isn't so hard. Save your selection. And this is going to be really useful later when we talk about painting without lines, because you can save certain selections. There's other ways to do the same thing that we'll talk about also, but that's a really great way to paint really fast and have it look very good with very nice edges, but no lines. You can also fill a selection, and we can clear the selections. Now, over here, this is my favorite menu. So this is our adjustments menu. So these would be layer styles, and these are layer adjustments. So right off the top here, we have hue, saturation, and brightness. So this is going to affect whatever's in this layer, the hue, the actual color of the object, right? And you can see how the camera is changing how it's doing the white balance based on the color selection. You can change the saturation to make it more or less saturated, and you can change the brightness. Now, where is that useful? How could we use that in a way that is useful? So let's talk about that. Let's actually back that up. And we're going to turn off this layer and turn this back on. Now, I have gone through here and added a highlight or a shadow layer and a highlight layer. The cool thing about this, about working this way where everything is separated into layers, is that now you can select that layer, you can duplicate that layer, you can turn the first one off, and then this new second layer, you can actually change the color of the highlight, the saturation of the highlight. Maybe you want it less saturated, but you want it like blue, or I guess yellow would be better. And so what this is going to do is that's going to allow us to select this new layer, come over here into hue, saturation, and brightness, and change that to any color that we want, and change the saturation, change the brightness. So a lot of the stuff that you'll see me do has to do with layers, because we want to keep this stuff very well separated so that we can go back as much as possible and edit what's in those layers as long as we need to. Now, it's also okay to paint in just one layer, but doing it this way is going to allow you more control over time. So if we keep this layer, that's what I like. So we're going to delete this one. We're going to go with the original. You can also come in here and go to color balance. What is your color balance of the layer? And so what you'll notice, same thing, right, is we're able to just change what's the color of that highlight layer, although it's not necessarily as strong as this hue, saturation, and brightness. Now, curves is extremely strong. There's a lot to do with curves. We're going to deal with that later. But you can really change how the pixels in that layer are represented by messing with the curves. It's going to be a lot stronger in black and white, but again, we'll deal with that later. Gradient maps are one of my favorites. So the thing about a gradient map is going to handle the value scale of the layer in a way that is dark on the left and light on the right. So each one of these is going to give us a different look. Let's actually do this. We are going to duplicate this group, and we're going to turn that group off, and we're going to squash this down. And we're going to put a gradient map and this is this blaze one, so it's like a nice monotone. The breeze one, mystic, these all come with Procreate, but you can change them all and change the appearance of them and where the bright colors show up. It's always going to handle everything as if this was the black in the image and this is the white, but these colors that you select here are the new colors you want. So you can slide where that brightness is. And you can really make these whatever you want. I have another couple videos about that topic if you're ever interested. The cool thing about these is you can really make them whatever you want. And then you can handle select parts of your painting with them, so you can handle the same thing over and over. So say you're developing a property, or you do a certain style of tattooing and you really like this black to green fade that you get. You can put that in here as it looks to you, like you can color pick from a picture as it looks to you, and put it in here, and then you know that, like, hey, when you do green, that's the fade that you use all the time, and it'll just put it right in there for you. You handle the gradients in your layer properly, and it will handle that part for you. So the cool thing about this, what I would do is duplicate it and then do the gradient map to the layer on top, because of how this works, it's going to change everything in the whole layer. So if you want to mask something out, you're going to want to so if you want to segregate those, so if you want to segregate that effect, then you'll just mask it out and then come back and paint in the mask to show where you want those colors to show up at. This is another topic we're going to get into later pretty deeply. Very powerful to work this way. A lot of people don't think about working this way, but it's very powerful and very fast. So all of these tools are meant to make us faster and more creative and able to create more. And it's definitely worth it to take the time to learn them and to play with them. You can add a blur to the layer. We'll deal with this later. Also, there's a lot of great uses for this. Once you add the blur, you have to slide the pen across the surface to change how much of the effect you're getting from that blur. You can also do it as a motion blur, which is going to be a like left to right kind of blur more than just blurred in every direction, and then a perspective blur, which is like normally going to be an iris or something where it's just focused on one depth of field. You can also add noise, sharpen, bloom if you're trying to add some weird camera effects or lighting effects to certain layers. Glitch, halftone, chromatic aberration. Not going to use those too much, but they don't get no use. Let's see what we can do with the halftone. So kind of the same thing. So it depends. If you're looking for a certain look and you want to make a certain look happen and that's the way, cool. I don't use that stuff very much, but it's there. It's useful for somebody. Now, one of the more fun tools to use is liquify, and what that's going to do is change all the pixels in your layer in a very strong fashion. So I can really just warp this any way that I want it, twist it, twirl it, make it into whatever I want. Very fast. So maybe you need to make it fit a certain body part. Maybe you want to make it look like it's bulging out in a certain way. It does it all, and it feels very organic. It feels like everything's supposed to be that way. Give everything more of an edge. Turn it all into weird paint runny. They're calling it crystals, but it doesn't really look like crystals. Reconstruct it means backing it up. And there's a lot of functions down here to change how the actual brush itself is working. On over here to the actions menu, you can add a file or photo, take a photo, add text, that's like the most out of place thing that I use the most often, where it's like very far away from all the other tools. I know it sounds weird to say because it's all right in here, but just using so over here in the actions menu, we have add, where it's going to let you insert a file or a photo, take a photo, add text, cut, copy, or paste. If you want to mess with the canvas, this is where you're going to be able to resize the canvas. And this is going to tell you when it first opens how many layers are available. And that's going to change based on the size and the DPI, the resolution of the canvas. So as you go up in size or resolution, the amount of layers you have goes down. And That's just something you'll get a feel for. But this, which is a regular 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper at full print resolution, I have 219 layers that I can work with. So it's very easy to really fine tune your drawings and your process to work around this, or to have this benefit you. Animation assist I don't use too much because it's mainly a timeline, and with tattooing I don't use it a whole lot. Page assist I also don't use too much, but I'm sure we can get into that later. The drawing guide is great because this is going to be a guide that helps you when you're drawing. So if we have to go into our layer, let's go into a new layer and pick drawing assist. This is now going to snap to these lines. I can't draw any diagonal stuff. It's all straight lines. If we get in here and edit the drawing guide, we can change the color of the drawing guide up here, and we can also change the layout of the drawing guide, the opacity, the thickness, the grid size, the assisted drawing, whether or not it will lock on for us. There's also the options for isometric perspective grids, which is great because it allows you to do 2 and 3 point perspective. You can tap to make your vanishing points, and then there's your perspective grid. 3 point perspective, no problem at all, and it'll snap to the lines. So as you're drawing, it's just all going to be locked into exactly the right thing, how it's supposed to be. So if you want, you can pull out a ruler and you can make all the lines, or you can make your perspective grid in this perspective in this window, and then once you have it, you can blow it up so that the grid itself is bigger than the page. I believe you might even be able to make the grid outside the page. Oh yeah, you can. Look at you go. So that's extremely helpful for drawing in perspective. Additionally, we have this function over here, symmetry, so that we can draw symmetrically. If you're doing faces or anything that needs to be symmetrical, why do both sides? Why do it twice when you can just do one side of it and be good to go? You can do that symmetry vertical, horizontal. You can have a quadrant, so it's 4-piece, or radial, so an 8-piece polygon, 8-piece mandala. It'd be more like a mandala. And then you can turn on or off rotational symmetry, which will make everything go the same way. So if you are just doing rotational symmetry, it would look like that. And if you have the symmetry, where are we at? The rotational symmetry on, it will look like this, where they all go the same way, and it's not really mirrored. You can add a reference photo, and what this is going to do is going to allow you to draw something that you're tracing without having that show in the video. I have not used that function yet, but somebody turned me on to it recently, and I might give it a try. So you can also flip horizontal and vertical and find your canvas information. You can also share from this menu, so if you need to share the image or send it to anywhere or send it to print, this is the menu you're going to do that at. The cool thing here is most of these, let's turn this off. I believe that these are always turned on. I'm not sure about that, but the great thing about it is that this time-lapse recording is always on for most of your drawings, so you can just go back at any time if you want some content to upload, or you need something to post. You can just go back and look at old drawings and put out the little video, and you'll be great. You'll be good to go. Turn off the drawing assist for the layer. There's also a section over here for preferences if you want the light or right-handed interface, dynamic brush scaling, projecting the canvas, the brush cursor, anything like that, and a help menu. So downloading 3D model packs, Procreate handbook, getting started with Procreate support, Procreate folio, or leave a review. I've never even been in this menu, so it probably won't come in very handy to you. So this week, I want to do a demo for you. So I want to do a demo for you, and this is going to be the homework for this week, and it's going to be extremely simple. There's no way for you to get in over your head. So right now, I have this purple circle, and let's get rid of it. And we're going to start a new one. I'm going to start a new purple circle. And the way I'm going to do this is you're selecting a color. I want you to use the color harmonies, and I want you to come up here under colors and select split complementary, and I want you to pick your favorite color. It can be any color as long as it's not all the way at the top or the bottom of the value scale or the outside of the color wheel. So aside from that, you have a lot of room to work here in the color picker. So pick your favorite color. This is not my favorite color, but I'm going to run with it. And we're going to make a circle-ish as good as we can. And then we're going to hold it. And then we're going to tap the screen. And now we have a perfect circle. Now we're going to click this color and drag it in. And now we have a perfect circle of paint. Perfect circle of purple. You know what I'm trying to say. So now what we're going to do is we're going to click this layer and we're going to alpha lock the layer. Right? That means that we cannot paint outside of the layer. We can change the color inside the layer or paint inside whatever is in that layer, but we don't want to use that right now. We just want to lock this layer up. So now what we're going to do is we're going to slide this to the left. We're going to duplicate the layer, and we're going to come in here to the color picker, and I've already selected this green color, so I'm going to run with that. And we put that all over. Let me actually get a better, bigger brush. And color this one green. So now we got a green one and a purple one. And now that we're on the green one, we're going to select the layer and we're going to bring it down and to the right. And we're going to select the purple layer and the move tool, and we're going to just push this up a little bit. Now what we want to do is select that green layer again, slide it to the left, duplicate it, select your color picker, get this other color, which is like a orange or gold of some sort. Color that layer. We're going to move that layer to the left. So now you have 3 uniquely colored layers. We're going to turn the top 2 off so we only have this purple layer for a minute. And what I'm going to do is show you 3 methods to color. So what I'm going to do is show you 3 methods to So what I want to do here is show you 3 methods to easily light and shade an object once you have the color selected. So we have this first color, okay, and we're going to color pick it so we have the same color. Now we know that when something gets darker, when it turns away from the light, it's going to get a little bit darker and a little bit less saturated, right? A little bit darker probably. And now we're going to use a new layer and a clipping mask so that we can't paint outside. And I have this big soft brush, and that big soft brush is going to handle the transition for me. Turn the edges in a little bit. And round it out. And make this look like a nice round ball. Now, we also know that when something gets brighter, it gets a little bit brighter, a little bit less saturated. And so we're going to use that up here, and that's going to be our highlight. So that's how we're going to paint in a shadow and a highlight and stay within the lines because we've used a clipping mask to put these together. Now, we're going to do something a little bit different on this one. On this one, we're just going to duplicate the layer and change that layer style to multiply. Now, we don't want the whole thing to be dark. And as you can see, the 2 greens in these 2 layers are the same, but because this layer is a multiply layer, it's just adding the values of both the layers together, or multiplying them together, I should say. So what we're going to do here is we want to mask on this layer, and we want to invert this. So we want this mask to be black, and that's going to hide the pixels of this layer. Okay, now what I'm going to do is use a big soft brush and white paint on this black mask to show what I want in that layer that's all dark. Now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to select this original layer, duplicate it again, change this layer to screen. You can see how it's made all the pixels in there light. Even though the multiply is over that, it's just going to multiply what's in the layer, multiply it with what's in the layer under it. So if you have a lighter layer, it's still going to affect both the layers, but doing it this way is going to allow us to really dial in exactly how we want these effects. So again, we're going to add a mask. We are going to invert that mask, and we are going to paint in where we want to show our effect. Right, so this is just using paint in the layers. This is using a multiply and screen layer to get our shadow and highlight. And on this one, we're going to do something a little bit different, but this one's my favorite. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to duplicate this layer, and we're going to go over here to the hue and saturation. And we are going to turn the saturation down, and we're going to turn the brightness down. And we're going to keep the hue the same, but we could cool it off or warm it up or whatever we want to do here. So Now, same thing, we're going to do the mask. We're going to invert the mask. We are going to paint in the effect where we want it. And it's not even going to let us, we're not even able to paint outside of the line, right? Like we can paint right up on the line by being on the other side of it, and we cannot go outside of where we're supposed to be. So let's get this turned in space the right way. You can turn down the opacity to control the effect. And we can do the same exact thing with this layer again. Hue saturation, a little bit less saturated, a little bit brighter. Add a mask, invert the mask, paint on the mask in white where you want your effects to show. So, to recap, we started with the purple sphere and then duplicated that sphere, or that circle, to make two other colors of circle. On that first sphere, we picked a darker color and we did the shadow area, and then we picked the lighter area and we did the highlight area. I like this because you can come in here into these different selections and go through here and play with different effects. This is how you find happy accidents in digital paintings, is most of them are in this menu. At least that's what I've found over the years since I've started using it. We'll just leave this one at normal for the moment. Same with the highlight layer. You can go through here. Same with the highlight layer. You can go through here and play with different effects to see what actually works best for you. Generally, screen is going to do the trick, but in this case, we're going to stick with normal because we just picked the color that we wanted in these layers. In the green layer, we duplicated the layer twice. One of these layers we made a multiply layer, and one of these layers we made a screen layer. We put a black mask on both of them and then painted white on them to show where we wanted the effects. This is the same thing that we did for this color circle, except for we did it with hue, saturation, and value sliders instead of with layer styles. So what I want you to do is just make a circle. Once you make that circle, actually where I want you to start is go in here, select color harmony, and split complementaries. Then pick your favorite color. Try to stay to the middle of the value slider. Okay? Once you pick your favorite color, make a circle. Let's get rid of all these. Make a circle. Duplicate that circle out a couple of times. You don't have to draw it twice. You already drew it once. Fill those circles with the colors in the split complementary. fill those circles with the split complementary colors, and then try to color all these in using all the methods that we talked about right here. So try to paint it in using different layers and a clipping mask and alpha locks. Try to duplicate the exact same layer and use screen and multiply layers, or go through the layer styles and try different layer styles and see what you like. Then also do the exact same thing on the third circle, but do it through hue, saturation, or color balance or curve sliders, and go from there. So play around, get used to the layers, get used to masking. These are super important things that is going to help your art greatly to understand how this system works and how you can use it to your benefit. So let's talk about values. The value scale. The tool which artists use to describe how light hits an object, casts shadows, and describes mass with no color information. We call it grayscale. We call it monotone. But what we mean is the shading, blending, and transitions contrast. Contrast in relation to the value scale refers to the difference in lightness or darkness between two adjacent areas within an artwork. The value scale represents the continuum of tones from white to black with various shades of gray in between. Contrast in the values occurs when there's a noticeable distinction between these tones. So if you render every value in this scale, that would be low contrast, because they're not very there's not much difference between each step, right? It's a nice smooth step. That's how you get a smooth blend. Using all the same colors close to each other, whereas using colors that are using tones or shades that are far apart on the value scale is going to give you high contrast. So if you use your black, because most of us in tattooing know the importance of black, and you blend that out some, and then you have a gap before you get to the lighter tones of shades, or lighter shades, and I'm only crossing out white here, presuming that we wouldn't even use that's a skin tone anyway. But that's going to be much more high contrast than rendering out the whole scale. So where does all of this come from? Well, all the light, or most of the light, until a few hundred years ago, came from the sun. Obviously the sun's sitting in outer space and it's shooting all of its rays out in a 360-degree ball, and we're only catching a very little bit of this energy on our planet, and we're really only catching it on one side of our planet at all times. It just so happens that the planet is rotating. That's why we get day and night. So that's really what I'm going to talk to you guys about for just a minute, right? So the sun, yeah, you guys get it. The sun shines its rays. The rays either hit the earth or they continue on to the next thing that they might hit, right? The side towards the earth is always daytime. The side towards the outer space is always nighttime, and the planet rotates. So here's our planet in outer space, and what we feel like is, it feels like the sun is going around us every day, right? The sun rises in the east and sets in the west, but the sun's actually not doing anything. All right, here we go. It's sunrise in the east and sunset in the west. So that's what it feels like.
The reality, though, is that, of course, the sun is stationary and the planets are spinning. And what that means basically is just like, you know, the same side stays lit all the time, and that the planet's going to be spinning in space. But in reality, what's happening is the Earth is spinning, maybe even counter to what you would expect. So how can we make this practical? So let's just take a gray circle on a black background, and we are going to make believe that these are the sun's rays, and they're hitting our planet or our object or our ball in this case, and they're actually going to bounce all over, you know, right? Like in outer space, those are going to bounce back into space. That's why the planet looks like it's glowing. In here, it's going to bounce around and hit the room and then bounce off the room back into your image. So if the light comes in at an angle and goes around, then we can see how it would bounce off the walls and illuminate the opposite side of the object just in the bounce light. But that bounce light is never going to be as bright as the highlight or the midtone, right? It's always got to be a little bit of light on the midtone. So the light comes in, the light bounces around, back onto the object. So how can we check this out in real space? So here I have a ball. I put this together in Marmoset tool bag, but here I have a sphere. And that sphere is on a table, and that table is getting light shown on it, and that ball is getting light shown on it. And that light is bouncing around the room, and some of it's hitting the table and bouncing back up and hitting the ball. So what I want to talk about is the anatomy of a shadow, right? So a lot of us would go spend the time to learn anatomy class, but we're not really super familiar with the anatomy of a shadow. So I think that's a real important side note. If you guys know this, it's not going to be anything groundbreaking. You can definitely take a break here. But just for the sake of everybody knowing, let's go ahead and go through with this. So a shadow is going to be made up of a few parts, right? The most basic is this local value. So the local value is going to be the color of your object, or in this case, it would be the value of your object or the grayness of your object. So if you have a 20% gray ball versus a 50% gray ball versus a 70% gray ball, you'd understand that one would be lighter and one would be darker, right? So that's going to be your local value. Then you have your highlight, this is where the light's coming in and hitting your object. And that's dictating really the surface of your object and the angle of the light, the angle it's turned towards the light, right? Where exactly it hits, where exactly the light is in space. From that point, the light is going to hit and curve around the ball and start bouncing, and you're going to have this form shadow, which is this area in here where it just starts to get softer. It's kind of hard to tell if it's hard to tell if it's getting grayer or if that's just the local color. After that, we have, of course, the core shadow. This is what everybody thinks of the shadow, like the dark part. But it's really not necessarily on the opposite end. It's like generally going to be somewhere on the shadow side of the middle. And then we have a cast shadow, that's actually the shadow that the light is casting around the ball, right? The ball is keeping the light from hitting the table. That's what's happening here. And that's why it's blurry, and it's sharp. You'll notice it's sharper closer to the ball and blurrier further away. Then, of course, we have everybody's favorite, reflected light. And what reflected light is doing is it's bouncing around the room and then illuminating the shadow side of the object, right? So by incorporating this, we can show a lot more of the shadow side of our object. We can bring a lot more interest. We can, there's a lot of stuff we can do. But in reality, all of these things are displaying how light wraps around an object, how volume fills a space, how an object looks sitting in front of you. And so let's just go through a couple of these and really nail down what each one of these things is. So as we can see here, the highlight is related to this bright spot and we'll get into this later, but how that bright spot is rendered is going to dictate how smooth or rough your object is. You have the local value. We have the form shadow, where the shadow is being cast by the object turning into or away from the light. We have the core shadow, which gets the least amount of light in the object. Then we have bounce light, where light is bouncing back up onto the object and illuminating it slightly. Then we have a cast shadow, where the ball is blocking the light of the sun from getting to the table, presumably. And that's why this shadow is so dark and so harsh. And you'll notice it's very harsh up close to the ball and very soft far away from the ball. That's because a little bit of that light is bouncing around and getting in there, whereas over here it's too tight for that. And okay, if we flip this ball on the other side, or we flip the light on the other side, actually, then same deal, right? Everything moves a little, and we can see how it moves. So the highlight moves over to the right. The local value is still really just the color of the object. The form shadow is going to be perpendicular to the light, right? So like whatever angle the light's showing at it, the form shadow's coming is like a flat plane that shadow is hitting, almost, or that light is hitting, right? It's going to be perpendicular to the light. Then we have our core shadow. That's going to be like the part of the object that gets the least amount of light. We have our bounce light. I didn't label this one apparently, but you can see where it's orange at the bottom of the ball. And then we have our cast shadow, where the ball is actually throwing a shadow onto the table. If we take this a step further, we can see that these shadows, those aren't the only places those shadows exist, right? So those names, those shadows, those parts of the shadow, they wrap around the object, and they're a part of the object and the light. So, this is a form shadow. This is also considered a form shadow because the effect that is being made here is because of the form of the object. The bounce light bounces in a couple different places. It bounces here on the bottom. It also bounces, it fills this whole area in, and it like softens up this other side of the shadow. The great thing about this is it works on anything, right? So everything reacts to light the same way, and light is a ray. It shoots in one direction and then it bounces, right? So that's an easy starting point, is that, hey, this is life, and we all have eyes, and we can all observe this stuff happening all day, every day. And if we take the time to like really focus on and understand it, it's going to feed back into your drawing skills a bunch, because everything that you render is going to be much more realistic. So let's take this to a little bit more detailed subject. So here we have a face. This is a head that I made in Character Creator and brought into Marmoset Toolbag to show this to you guys. And everything's the same, right? So we still have local value, highlight, core shadow, form shadow, bounce light, and cast shadow. Did I say form shadow twice? In any event, that stuff's all the same. And once again, we're looking at a more detailed design. If you take this a little further, you can see that those shadows repeat and happen at more than one place in the design. So just consider that, is that this is about how light wraps around forms, and the more complex those forms get, the more variation they're going to have. And that's what's going to give you like a texture. So if you're looking at something like this, such as a face where it's a bunch of outward pushing curves, it's going to affect them differently depending on how they're situated on the whole head as a whole, right? So you'll notice one cheek gets different light than the other cheek, right? It's because the head is round, so like a ball can only see half of it, but we also have muscle forms on this ball, and that's why little parts will peek back out into the light. So it's very interesting, but it's not very complicated. And the same is true, of course, if we flip this back to the other side. If we flip the light back to the other side and then follow all the lights, we can see all the places that these same 6 categories of shadows show up, right? We have local value, the highlight right here on the forehead, a little bit on the nose, a little bit on the neck. We have a form shadow. That's where things are turning away from the light but are not necessarily in shadow. And the edges of the cast shadows We have cast shadows both in the object, outside of the object, core shadows, and bounce light everywhere, under the lips, under the eye, under the chin, right? So this is dictating a lot of what we see in the shadow side is this bounce light, right? Now this bounce light should never be as light as your local value, right? Because it's going to be the local value in the shadow side kind of being lit up a little bit or lit back towards the local value. It's always going to be less than. So keep that in mind.
So thank you for sitting through all that with me. And I know it's pretty basic for a lot of us, but I think that it is super important when it comes to, if you're going to try to draw something and you see, drawing anything realistic as a milestone, then understanding these concepts are pretty important. And understanding the tools is going to help you go a lot faster, help you get to your finished product a lot faster. So if you want to do the homework this week, the whole trick is to get comfortable with the layer system and the masks, because I think that's something that is underutilized. And if we can just knock that out right now with using simple circles, that'll be the easiest way to understand it, in my experience. So I'm going to have you go into the palette, go into the color harmonies, pick split complementary, and pick your favorite color. You're going to make a circle by drawing an ellipse with your pen, and then you're going to hold your finger down, and that's going to make it a perfect circle. Then you're going to drag the color in the top right corner of the screen into the circle, creating a circle with no black outline that's just this one color. Then you need to alpha lock that layer, duplicate it 2 times, and fill each of those layers with the alternate colors in the color packet without changing the relationships between the colors. Then I'm going to want you to attempt 3 styles of shading using the layers. I want you to use a soft brush and hard eraser, or a hard brush and soft eraser, and layers and clipping masks. This is not to make a cool finished product. This is just to make something that you can understand the layers with. I want you to duplicate at least 2 of those colors to try shading with layer styles, the multiply and screen methods, and also the hue saturation values. And remember, you're going to have to put a mask on and invert the masks. At this point, you're going to know layering, masking, and 3 methods to get yourself to full color insanely quick. Once you've done that, find 10 images from wherever you want. They can be movie stills, or they can be other people's drawings. I'd really rather you work from pictures, but grab 10 of them and just try to identify the style, the shadow, the anatomy of the shadow as we have discussed it here. And that's just so that when you start drawing and you know something's missing, you can tell that it's missing, right? And you know when you have to go up to the edge, when you don't have to go up to the edge. All of that's very important to your success as an artist, especially if you are into, the realism side of things at all. If you're not, don't worry. We're going to have a lot in this class that is going to help you out. But my 2 cents is to try to figure that stuff out as early in the process as possible, so that you're not tripping over yourself trying to figure it out later. So thank you guys for watching, and we'll be back with the next one as soon as possible.